Hi, I'm Kathleen Stinnett, and I have been working with the Enneagram for a dozen years. I've used the Integrative Enneagram assessment that you just completed with almost all of my clients for the last 10 years. And I just love this tool and the insight it gives us. So the purpose of this conversation today is to really walk you through the key elements of the Enneagram, understand key sections of your report, so that as you look at your own results and think about the results of those around you, it'll make more sense. And we'll leave our conversation with a few thoughts on how you keep moving and developing with this tool. So let's start with, what is the Enneagram? Some people would say that a simple way to describe it is that it's a personality tool. It describes personalities. And that is true. And I think it's so much more, because as soon as I understand what my Enneagram type is out of 9 different types, then my whole developmental pathway unlocks and opens up. I particularly love this quote by Mary Bast. The Enneagram portrays the strength and limitations of our inner habits of attention and response. In one sense, our Enneagram style is a trance. Or you could say it's my stance to the world, or it's the lens that I look through which I see the world. And we know that our personalities are created both by nature and nurture. We know that we have some genetic predispositions toward optimism and pessimism, or introversion and extroversion. And then we meet our primary caregivers as children, and early on we learn that if I do certain behaviors, I get more positive strokes and fewer negative ones. And so both of these variables and a whole complex suite of choices we make subconsciously or perhaps consciously later in life form our personality. And these become patterns. And what we know about the Enneagram and personality is, once it's locked in, which usually happens in our late teens or right around the time we turn into adults, our patterns and our personality is locked in for the rest of our lives. In very, very rare circumstances, could someone have a complete personality change? Perhaps if they experience something traumatic and significant. Otherwise, our personalities are going to be with us for the rest of our lives. So the Enneagram ultimately gives you a type out of 9 types. And it's not meant to box you in, but instead to show you how your choices and repeated patterns, your habits, have become the box you've actually put and kept yourself in. And the reason this tool is called Integrative Enneagram is because with our awareness and consciousness, we want to be integrating other choices into our repertoire. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later. So this describes our primary motivational drivers, not necessarily our behaviors. Of course, if I'm motivated by something, it's going to be influencing my feelings and my thoughts and my behaviors. So here's the question on the screen. It's Saturday morning and your neighbor is mowing the lawn. Why would they do that? Why would anyone begin mowing their lawn at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning? Why would you do that? And of course, there could be any number of different reasons. One person might be entertaining. They want their lawn to look good. Somebody else might say it's cool earlier in the day. It's going to be too hot later. Maybe that's the only window of time somebody else has. And finally, somebody might choose to do that to get even with their neighbor who is partying until 2 in the morning. So the behavior is the same, person mowing the lawn, but why they're doing that behavior is very, very different. And so what the Enneagram reveals to us are our deep, driving, habitual motivations that, of course, then show up in our thinking and feeling and acting. So here are the 9 types and the key motivational drivers. And you can see that every type has a phrase, a description. So the type 1 is strict perfectionist, and the type 5 is the quiet specialist. and what they are motivated to solve for as a key pattern in their life is what you see here on this screen. And we will do a little dive into each of the 9 types so that you can see both the strength and the limitations of any of these stances to the world. I also want to point out that we can look at this figure in 3 sections. There's an action center, a feeling, or sometimes this is called the image center, and a thinking center. And later we'll talk about your own preferences, because you have a preference in the way that you move into action. You have a preference in the way that you create a positive image in the world, and you have a preference in terms of how you think. And so we'll reveal this to you later, because you are complex as an individual and far more than just your main type. So let's start with our type 1, which is in the action center. Type 1 is called the strict perfectionist. And the type 1 is oriented to do the right thing the right way. Sometimes they want to do it perfectly, but more importantly, they want to be excellent at whatever they take. So the action is, I'm trying to control myself to do the right thing the right way, perfectly, excellently, with high quality. And though type 1 brings to us some wonderful strengths, and I'll share the strengths and shadows for all of the 9 types, the type 1 will have a focus on quality and details. They're super organized. They will uphold standards. They'll want to follow the process. If there's 10 steps in a process, then let's follow all 10 steps. That's what makes sense. And so there's just goodness that the type 1 brings. Of course, the shadow side is that the type 1 can see the world through a lens of there's right and wrong, there's good or bad. And so if this isn't the right thing, then obviously that only leaves us with one other choice, the wrong thing. And the type 1 is seen as one of the more critical, self-critical types, because I can find where I didn't do things right. And I can also be critical of others when I perceive others as not doing the right thing the right way excellently. So that's a quick snapshot of our type 1. Our type 2 is called the considerate helper. The type 2 is motivated to be generous and warm and giving, and they're anticipating what needs other people have, and they want to be helpful to try to get the other person's needs met. So sometimes the 2 will be helpful even when they're not needed to be helpful. And their mantra is that they really do want to contribute to others. Now, the motivation for the 2 is because ultimately they want that reflected back to them so that they can be seen as helpful and that they can be loved and liked and appreciated because of that helpfulness. So our 2 strengths, they tend to be warm and generous and giving, interested in a connection, wanting to be helpful. They tend to be pretty good at having social radar. They sense when people are happy or upset. They sense what people might need. So that's the strengths of our 2s. And of course, our shadows is sometimes the 2 is giving to get something in return, whether that's appreciation or the sense that they are lovable, or sometimes they give, and when they don't get that appreciation back, they double down on their giving, and this can lead to a feeling of resentment or pride. And so the vice of the 2 is pride. Don't you see how much I'm helping? Don't you see how much I'm giving? For both the type 2 and the type 3, sometimes people will experience them as being chameleon-like, because we can shape shift a little bit. I can see what's needed and shape myself just a little differently to meet the moment. And so that can be a little chameleon-like. The 3 also shares that. The 3 is called the competitive achiever. And so the competitive achiever has a vision of what success looks like. They can look around and say, gosh, to be successful, I need to be doing certain things. I need to behave in a certain way. And so they're trying to present an image of success, and genuinely, they do want to be successful. So our threes tend to be goal-oriented, and they want to be effective and efficient and get things done well. Unlike the type 1, the 3 doesn't have to do it perfectly, but they want to do a good job because that is their definition of success. And so the strengths that the 3 tends to exhibit are effective, efficient, they're competent. When they're at their best, they inspire others to be at their best. They can be glorious in almost anything that they undertake, and they tend to get a lot done well. You've heard the adage, if you want something done, give it to a busy person. The 3s are the busy people that you can probably give more to, and they're going to get it done. Now, the shadow side is that the 3s can oftentimes cut themselves off from their own feelings because they're so busy pursuing their to-do lists and their task lists. And it's hard for 3s to relax or to believe that they have value and worth without doing and achieving. You can see the word hubris, and I like to think of our 3s as having hubris because they believe that they are capable of so many things. And in fact, it really is true. They can get a lot done, and they don't tend to take on tasks where they feel like the failure is a real possibility. Our 4s are called the intense creatives. And if you just separate those two words, intense, they feel feelings deeply. They feel the full range of feelings. They're comfortable with emotions, theirs and others. And they tend to be more creative, more self-expressed. They believe that the way that they will get the world to reflect back to them in a positive way and create a positive image, but is by being authentic. So our 4s tend to be very authentic, and they don't want surface shallow conversations. They want to go deep with you. So the strengths of our 4s, they are that sensitive, authentic, self-aware, emotionally honest people. 4s tend to be truth tellers. If they're in a room and something is happening and everyone else wants to look beyond that and not pay attention to it, that 4 will say, how can we look beyond this thing that we can all see? And so they tend to be the ones who are willing to engage in that level of conversation. The shadow side of the 4 is that they do tend to experience their emotions. Now, not all 4s are the same here. And so we'll talk a little bit later about instincts. Because our self-preservation 4s will tend to be a little sunnier and happier than some of our other type 4s. But the 4 will look through a lens of what's missing. There's a nostalgia. They can look back and say, gosh, I used to have this, or a longing, romanticism of what could be. And so there's a quality of what's missing that sometimes 4s experience, or they tend to envy others or feel misunderstood. The 4 is the least represented of Enneagram types in corporate settings. So often our 4s thrive better on the outside of our organizational structures when authenticity and self-expression perhaps may be more welcomed. Our 5 moves us into the thinking triad. So the 5 is the quiet specialist. And the 5 is motivated to make sense of the world. They're seeking to understand. And so they like gathering information and gathering more data until they can make sense of it and come up with mental constructs and a way of understanding how the world works. Our 5s also like conserving their resources. They wake up in the morning and say, gosh, I only have so many resources and so much energy, and I've got to be really protective of that because things feel draining when the world comes in and tries to get access to our 5s. So what do 5s give us? Wisdom, depth, understanding. They tend to be objective and curious. They tend to be able to look at a situation or a problem just with a lot of detachment, so they can understand it. The shadow side then is that others experience our 5s perhaps as being detached, maybe even withdrawn. And they like to conserve resources. So sometimes the 5s will be in their office with their door shut because they're trying to protect their energy and resources. Our 6s, also in our thinking triad, They tend to be focused on the group, being loyal to the group, being loyal to a cause bigger than themselves. They want the group to cross the finish line together. And their thinking tends to pay attention to what's going to go wrong. Where are the hazards? Where are the threats? And so our sixes tend to be planful. They put plans together and contingency plans together, and they feel hyper alert because they're paying attention to what could go wrong. And so the strengths for our sixes, they are devoted to a cause or a group bigger than themselves. And they tend to be super prepared. They tend to have thought through what might happen in worst case scenarios, and they have plans and contingency plans. The downside for the six is sometimes they will be experienced as perhaps slower to make decisions, or glass half empty instead of glass half full. The personal experience of the six is because there is doubt, that sometimes sixes will doubt themselves, and they have what I like to call success amnesia, that they might have been super successful and have completed a great project and could feel really good about that. And yet it doesn't stay with them. That sense doesn't stay with them. So sometimes sixes need to be reminded of how well they have done. Our sevens are the last of our thinking types. And our sevens are big picture thinkers. They're enthusiastic visionaries. They're thinking about what's ideal that we can move to in the future. They tend to be visionary and have big ideas and synthesize ideas from disparate areas. And they bring kind of a joy and a vibrancy. And they tend to have a fun quality, and maybe they're a little bit more spontaneous, or they tend to see the world in terms of what's possible. And so if things don't work out, the seven doesn't get dismayed. They say, well, what else is possible? There's more ways that we can do this. And so there's a kind of uplifting quality that most sevens bring. The downside of the seven is trying to avoid pain. And so sometimes the seven can be distracted. They distract themselves in pursuit of what else is possible and what else looks fun and what else. And so sometimes sevens have a harder time being with discomfort, being with pain. They like to escape, and they do that through thinking about and anticipating what's next. Our eights move us back into our action triad, and the eight is called the active controller. Now, other groups and other people that write about the Enneagram might call the eight the leader or the boss or the challenger. And so I want to be clear that eight is not trying to control the world, but they want someone to be in control. They don't like weakness or vulnerability. And so when they start experiencing weakness or vulnerability, the eight compensates by being strong. And if things are chaotic, they're going to put order and structure in place. And so eights have a capacity and aliveness. You feel when an eight is in the room. They just embody kind of strength when they come into a room. They tend to be decisive. They tend to be willing to take challenges and take charge and take the hill. They also tend to be oriented toward fairness and justice, and they're protective of people in their inner circle. Eights tend to be straightforward and direct. And of course, the shadow side is oftentimes people in the presence of an eight who's going to be direct and straightforward and decisive and willing to move forward and take action. They might find that a little intimidating, or that the eight might dominate the environment. Most eights I've talked to have had the experience of getting feedback that would suggest they're intimidating, and yet they don't see it or they don't understand it, and certainly isn't their intent. Our nine then is our last type, and the nine also is in our action triad. And the nine is called the adaptive peacemaker. The nine wants to take action that will create the most harmony and the greatest good for the greatest amount of people and the least amount of conflict. And so nines are motivated to avoid conflict and to keep the peace. And you can imagine then that nines are more gentle or kind or patient or accepting. They're going to seek out others' opinions. They're going to try to understand how others are affected by decisions, and they're going to want to take action that creates the most good and the most harmony and the least amount of conflict. And so you can imagine then that a shadow might be that they're conflict avoidant, or that they withdraw when the heat gets turned up. They might be seen as indecisive, and perhaps they are, or perhaps they're taking longer to make a decision because they're trying to get more input to really understand what action will create the most harmony. Sometimes nines will be self-forgetting because they're so oriented to others.